Hello, and welcome to this episode of Standing Apart, the podcast about what makes people, businesses, and ideas distinctive in a world full of imitation. With me, Nigel Ridpath. Today, we are talking about being effective, which seems to be a pressing issue in the world of work today. I wrote a chapter on personal effectiveness in the Time Traveller's Guide to Management, but my protagonist didn't have to compete with AI for his job in ancient Persia. To explore this topic, I spoke to Melissa Swift, who has just written a book called Effective: How to Do Great Work in a Fast-Changing World. Melissa is a leading voice on how organizations, teams, and individuals can succeed in an ever more challenging world of work. As founder and CEO of Anthro Insight, she is a practicing consultant and keynote speaker. Prior to that, she had held consulting leadership roles at Capgemini, Mercer, Korn Ferry, and Deloitte, and her quarterly columns in MIT Sloan Management Review often rank amongst their most read articles. So, Melissa, hello.
Hi there.
Hi. Really excited to get into this conversation today. Yeah, before we start talking about effectiveness and the book you've written, just give me a little background on yourself and how you got to this point.
Hey, terrific. So I am an organizational consulting entrepreneur. My company, Anthro Insight, is about, 18 months old, something like that. And before that, I was a veteran of leadership roles in corporate consulting. I ran practices for Mercer, for Korn Ferry, for Capgemini. Did a lot of work for very large, complex organizations, and ultimately kind of had this epiphany that I really wanted to have sort of a different focus on let's say a different kind of subset of issues than I had focused on in corporate life, and also kind of go about the work differently. So that spurred me into entrepreneurship, which has been amazing so far.
Okay, and this is your second book
Yeah.
called Effective. Tell us a little bit about your author journey.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I was always kind of a big writer. I wrote columns and articles and white papers and just wrote. But I hadn't written a book. And I got quoted in Axios saying something a little bit funky about, technology has separated us from the humans doing the work. And an editor at Wiley reached out to me and said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I was like, only my whole life, I was super excited. So that book became Work Here Now. Which, was kind of an exploration of all the ways that modern work is sort of broken, right? That there are just all these places where it's a little creaky and rushed and messy and, all of that. So that was, book number one.
Mm.
And then I got the same question over and over after I wrote that book. People kept saying, "Melissa, great description of the problem, right? You nailed it. I feel all these things. Thank you for putting words against things that I experienced and couldn't articulate. Great stuff." But they would then say, "But I'm not in control of these forces at my organization."
Mm.
And it was a little spooky because sometimes the person saying that would be, the CEO.
Mm.
And you're going, well, if you're not in, but it's accurate. Work is kind of a multi-layer, multifaceted, multimodal problem. So if you're having a tough working day, it could be your boss's fault, or it could be whoever invented notifications. There's just a lot going on, and there's no single cause of these issues. So my motivation for writing Effective was very simple. Okay, what can we as individuals and working teams do to just get through this mess a little bit better?
So let's get to the nub of it. What does effective mean? What does it mean to you?
I think for me, it's you're able to get done the things you really need to get done. I think, productivity culture is very interesting because it's all this kind of like hustle and, I knocked out 37 items, and that's not effectiveness. Is I did the three things I really needed to get done and I did them well.
Yeah.
There's a real problem in modern work with getting people kind of the time and space to actually do things well. And that's a big theme of the book is how do you engineer the world around you to make sure things actually get done, not just done, but done properly.
Yeah. Can my idea of effectiveness be different to yours? And how does that work in a boss employee kind of relationship?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. I think the first chapter of the book, I talk about one of the things you need to do is actually sit down and map out your vision of what you think your job is versus what your boss thinks your job is versus what your peers think your job is versus what your customer thinks your job is. If
Mm,
you sit down and kind of map all those different angles out, what does your boss's boss think your job is?
mm,
In general, there's a lot of dissonance, but it's constructive to have written it down and thought about it because then you can go have a conversation with your boss about, okay, I see this point of friction or dissonance. And it's the reason why I counsel people to talk about, what is the job versus how is the person doing it is because once you get into how am I doing it, that's very smushy, emotionally fraught territory.
mm.
And to your point, that can be super subjective. Take it out of that realm. Talk about the job. What is the job?
Yeah.
That's the conversation that's a lot easier to have and ultimately gets you further.
Yeah. And it could be that some of those stakeholders you've just mentioned have got a different need out of you for that job as well. I mean, I'm just thinking of like a customer services representative, the boss might be, how quickly can we close this call down? But let's say you're an 80-year-old lady who's dealing with a bank or whatever, and she's a bit confused about how to do this and that. The effectiveness for her is really solving her problem in a way she can understand. So, that I guess that can create some tensions.
There's real tensions. And I love that you brought up customer service because I think customer service roles are at like one of those kind of modern jobs that's just at complete flashpoint.
Mm,
Because there's also all that sort of technological stuff going on there too. That let's say you're a customer service representative and there's a chatbot that comes before you, so everything easy gets done by the chatbot,
yeah.
and so you only get the angry, annoyed, right? And then to your point, your boss wants you to move faster because it's like, we got the chatbot in here. We're going to be like churning calls like you wouldn't believe. But each call is more difficult and emotionally fraught because, again, all the transactional stuff went to the chatbot.
Yeah.
So there's just, these natural, interesting frictions. And, technology is part of that friction too.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, the thing I really, really found interesting when I read your book was, and it's placed about halfway through, it's looking at effectiveness in high stakes jobs. And partly I'm interested because my elder daughter's a surgeon. She's starting off in a surgery career, and I'm kind of amazed by what she does on a daily basis. So tell us a little bit about what you learned by looking at those sorts of jobs.
I like that chapter. That might sneakily be my favorite chapter. Because it's like I had to organize the information, but there's brilliance from the three people that I interviewed in that chapter. And that for me is so exciting. So I interviewed a firefighter, an air traffic controller, and an emergency room physician.
Mm,
And, the idea was to just understand, okay, in knowledge work, consulting, right? I've been a
mm,
leader at big, complicated consulting firms, 100 people reporting to me. Um, and kind of just doing stuff off the cuff and, another RFP came in. How are we going to approach this one? It can feel very anecdotal in sort of these strange ways. And, even in what you would think of as for consulting, fairly high stakes scenarios.
mm,
So I was kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, when, if you really did not have the option, like your daughter, right, is surgeon, you don't have the option of being a bit lackadaisical. How do you do work differently?
yeah.
And I just loved what I learned. I mean, so for instance, the emergency room physician I spoke to, Dr. Rebecca Parker, has a methodology for being good at being interrupted, which was like the coolest thing I've ever heard. And what she does is every time she sits down to do a task, let's say working through notes from a patient she just saw, she maps out what are the natural stopping points. And so if she's not at one of those natural stopping points when someone interrupts her, she goes, whoop, nope,
Yep.
wait, right? Let me get to my natural stopping point and then I can be safely interrupted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that. I love that. I think there's something about that level of kind of digging into how you do the work that is just, it's very powerful. Or
Yeah.
another example, the firefighter that I spoke to, Ro Rodriguez, um, he was about to go to a course on how to use a new kind of rope. I'm like,
Right.
really? Rope? But rope is a critically important technology for firefighters. The next time you have to rappel up to the roof, really need to know all the ins and outs of how to use that rope.
Yeah.
And so it was funny to me because, half the technology that I use at work, I can kind of make a nice presentation in Canva.
Mhm.
It's not the same level of intensity and focus. And I do think there's something to be learned from those high stakes jobs and, kind of the level of focus, the level of intentionality, but also the way that high stakes jobs, the folks make them kind of boring and
Mm-hmm.
repetitive. Because if your brain can be boring and repetitive about the pieces that are truly done over and over, it frees up the space and creativity for the unexpected. You don't want to be rethinking every time how you're going to cut into a patient, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the methodology, scalpel, you're buttoned up on that. So then if you cut open a patient and then you see a tumor you didn't expect, right? You have the brain capacity for that. And again, I
Yeah.
think that's just a great lesson for all of us.
Yeah. One of the things I heard from from a doctor, a surgeon years ago, was that they have a mantra called "See one, do one, train one," and I have often thought about that in the context of the work that I do, which is more akin to the work that you do, and the whole idea is that when you watch your first one, you're paying so much attention because the expectation is next time one of these things, these types of surgery comes around, you're going to be doing it. Now, that doesn't mean you've kind of like half switched on to learning that technique. You've absolutely got to be fully present watching that first procedure because you're doing it next time. And the third time, you've got to be able to train someone else how to do it. And I think that focus is thoroughly important. I remember speaking to a team leader of an IT company who was just getting frustrated that her guys just couldn't, it was a backup situation and they couldn't, it couldn't reliably do the job, even though she'd shown them 3 or 4 times. And so I told her about this technique, and it's, you tell people that the second time that this thing happens, you're doing it. So take whatever notes you want, ask me whatever questions you want, but you're doing the next one. And actually getting that discipline into the kind of knowledge work that you and I do, that's quite a step up.
It's powerful. And it's interesting because I think in consulting particularly, in more recent years, we've neglected that C1 piece. That sort of the way young consultants learn is through observation. And, through various issues like, people working virtually, although you can still get people, I think, working virtually, very good visibility onto things. But, kind of different factors. I don't know that consulting firms are as good at getting young people literally observing work as they used to be. And I think it's a real shame because to your point, that observation stage when you are frantically watching because you know you're going to do it the next time, it's critical.
Yeah. So through the process of writing the book, what outcomes what conclusions did you reach as a result of doing the research?
It was interesting because the research kind of validated my spidey sense a bunch of
Okay.
times. Like, anytime you do a piece of writing, you're forced to kind of chase your half-formed thoughts all the way to the ground, right? And that's one of the reasons why I love writing. And I think writing is so good for your cognition. Having to do that is really, really good for you. So, for example, I'd always kind of had this aversion to chaotic working environments. Like I like, high tempo environments or lively ones. I mean, at one point early in my career, I worked on a trading floor, like
Right.
that's not without some chaos, but there's a certain level of chaos at which I kind of get allergic, right? I just kind of go, I just really, I instinctively I get this malevolent feeling about it. And I was always just sort of like, why do I feel, it should just be kind of like neutral to bad. Why do I have this like ick about it? And so I dug into the research on chaos, and researchers actually have statistically correlated chaotic environments to every type of bad behavior at work except for sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, for whatever reason, is uncorrelated. But supervisory bullying, peer-to-peer conflict, and bad relationships with customers, back and forth with customers, are all correlated to chaotic environments. And that, for me, really explained kind of my instinctive, like, ooh, I kind of feel like, things get weird when it's a bit chaotic, because actually that is when bad behavior comes out.
Okay.
And that's a bit why, I'm fascinated. And Rita McGrath speaks about this sometimes, that more of the good thinking from the academic world doesn't sort of permeate into professional practice, because I think more folks would have aha moments like that if they truly dug into the academic literature on some of these concepts.
Yeah. Yeah. So ineffectiveness is caused by the environment, is what is how you're concluding. Clean up the environment, so. And people are going to get more effective.
I tend to think so. I tend to think and this is very classic, people who work on jobs thinking, is that the environment is kind of the overall lift. So think of that like in stock market terms, that's the alpha, right? The overall movement of the market is the environment makes you to some degree effective or ineffective. And I've got a whole chapter, by the way, about here's how to tell if your environment is making you ineffective, because I think it's important to give yourself some grace and say, okay, this is not working out. The other piece is the kind of the beta is also, are you a right match to the job, and is the job designed properly? And I talk about that in that chapter too, that, for example, in many of us, and this has happened to me in my own career, you get hired to a job that the organization hates. And there's something really interesting and powerful about that concept that came out in one of the qualitative interviews that I did for the book. I think it was Mary Ciani, who's my mentor, my former boss, and just a brilliant consultant, said something about that. And I almost like sat up straight. It was this shock of recognition, because, she was describing that for her, that, again, sometimes you get hired to a role and the organization doesn't want that role. Forget anything about you. And that's happened to me as well, that if the organization is organ rejecting your job, you really don't have a prayer of being effective in that job.
So what tip would you give to a candidate for a job sitting there in the interview room? How can you? What are those little telltale signs that this might be?
I love that question. Yeah,
you might not have a prayer of being effective in this.
Oh my goodness. So number one, sorry, this is going to be very cynical. If the job says we need you to be a change agent, don't take that job, because that means the organization has some deep aversion to something, and you are expected to unilaterally overcome that deep aversion.
Yes, having just arrived in the organization, right?
Exactly. Yes, that is such a good point, right? Being brand new, no knowledge of the culture, you're going to just sweep in and change everything. That is a corporate myth, right? So change agent is one. Dotted reporting lines, that's another one, because it's hard enough to work for, I'll quote Seinfeld, when Paul O'Neill says, it's hard enough to hit one home run, let alone two. Paraphrasing that, it's hard enough to work for one boss, let alone two.
Yeah.
It's generally a tell that the underlying structure of the role is confused. Yeah. And you're also relying on two other people who are not you to work well together.
Yeah.
So those are certainly a couple of gnarly ones to watch out for.
Yeah. We've got 20 minutes into this conversation without talking about AI.
That's got to be a record.
Yeah, I know, which pretty much does have to be a record. But it's got to be changing things, right?
It is and it isn't. I take this very kind of like pull the lens back view of technology. Like half the time I completely freak people out when I'm talking about technology, because I start talking about crows and sticks. because crows can actually use sticks to perform small
Yep.
tasks, which
Yep.
I think actually intellectually puts them ahead of my dog. So it's very impressive. And studies show that crows prefer to perform the task with a stick. They actually get enjoyment out of using what for a crow is technology. And humans started off with, again, simple technology, like, spears and things like that and rocks. And AI to me is just, it's one long continuum of how we use things to do work. In kind of my framework, there are two sort of enabling pieces that make us effective. One is working with people and one is working with technology. And technology is just stuff. AI is just stuff. It's just interestingly packaged, interestingly operating stuff. So when people are kind of going, this is unprecedented, it's precedented.
Yes. I think I've had personal experience of people who are using AI who are both effective and ineffective. I mean, that tool is not necessarily helping ineffective people be effective.
Oh, there was a great piece in MIT SMR actually that where the researchers concluded that it makes effective people more effective and ineffective people more ineffective. This is the
Yeah.
research I live for.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And if you think about, I don't know, maybe you're producing a bit of marketing copy or something like that, and you've got a great copywriter. Now they may use AI to help them with an idea or that sort of thing, and they will absolutely check every single word that goes out in the final result. But if you've got a poor copywriter using the same tools, you're going to end up with probably even worse garbage than if they'd written it manually.
Yeah, I mean, there was one study on software engineering at a particular firm where the rate of code that had to be reworked had gone up something like 856% due to AI use. I mean, I'm sorry, I know that percent. That's people are probably going, Melissa, you made that percentage up. No, it was literally something in that magnitude. It was in the 800.
Yeah.
And that's exactly that. There's not necessarily a virtue in being able to do bad work faster. In fact, it may be far worse. It's a bit like, the cartoon, The Sorcerer's Apprentice with the multiplying, brooms
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
mops or whatever they are, right? It didn't make Mickey's life easier. And that's a bit of what's going on right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So just kind of wrapping all of this up, what have you personally put into practice as a result of the work you've done and the interviews and the research and everything? Yeah, what's changed in your world that is making you more effective?
So, I think number one, based on the interviews with the folks who do high stakes work, I have just tried to get a lot more intentional
Yeah.
in, kind of like I need a replicable method for things I do over and over. And, even if I think I have one, let me articulate it to myself. Every time I sit down to write a presentation, am I consciously, do I start with an outline? Do I start with a mind map? Right? Consciously, how am I doing that? I think also based on a lot of the other interviews, I have really thought a lot about kind of how I communicate and this notion of coherence. I had two, you know, eh, very smart interviewees, a consultant and a CHRO, both independently start talking about coherence. And I'm kind of going, that's a thing. Um, and this idea that everything's got to kind of actually work together in a way that works. So it might not be, if somebody looks at my business from the outside, does everything actually work together? There's got to be that coherence there. Because in a world where we're just bombarded with messages and there's so much going on, you really have to make sure your house is in order behind the scenes. And that really powerfully stuck with me.
Mm. Yeah, they seem like great final takeaways. Melissa, it's been an absolute pleasure having a chat through the whole topic of effectiveness with you today. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
One of the things I enjoy most about hosting this podcast is finding ideas that challenge the assumptions we all carry around with us. My conversation with Melissa certainly did that. When we think about standing apart, we often imagine exceptional people doing extraordinary things. But Melissa offered a different perspective. She suggested that effectiveness isn't about hustling harder, working longer hours, or ticking off endless tasks. It's about identifying the few things that really matter and doing them well. That struck a chord with me because modern work often rewards activity over achievement. We're surrounded by notifications, meetings, and distractions, all creating the illusion of productivity. Melissa's argument is that effectiveness comes from creating the right environment rather than simply trying harder within the wrong one. I was particularly fascinated by examples from high-stake professions: an emergency room doctor who plans for interruptions, a firefighter who continually practices with equipment until it becomes second nature. These people don't rely on talent or heroic effort. They rely on systems, routines, and deliberate practice. There's a lesson there for all of us. Effective people are unlikely to be the busiest people. They're often the folks who have thought most carefully about how they work. Another insight I took away was Melissa's view on technology and AI. Rather than seeing AI as something revolutionary, she sees it as just another tool. And tools don't automatically make us better. In fact, they often magnify whatever habits we already have. Effective people become more effective. Ineffective people can become even more ineffective. So my biggest takeaway from this conversation is simple. Real effectiveness isn't about doing more. It's about being more intentional, understanding what matters, creating the conditions for success, and developing repeatable ways of working that allow you to perform at your best when it really counts. And that perhaps is what standing apart is all about too. I put a link to Melissa's book in the show notes. It's well worth a read. That's almost it for this episode. I hope you've heard something you can put to work in your business straight away. If you have, do someone a favour and share this episode with them. All past episodes are still available, so do have a browse, and I can't believe this is my 25th episode. I have a few more fascinating guest interviews lined up. To ensure you don't miss them, make sure to subscribe. And a quick reminder, this show only grows if listeners like you back it. The algorithms will not do it for us. So if you can, hit subscribe, leave a rating, and tap that like button in your podcast app. It really does help me out. Until next time, whatever you do, stand apart from the crowd. Standing Apart is a Sun Bear Consulting production.